God, man, like just on a meta note, diving into some of these studies, you know, I was already skeptical. Like my trajectory has basically been naively pro-science from, I don't know, after undergrad or something, just being like, we can study this, like, let's do it. And then since then, I've just been on a trajectory of getting more and more suspicious, more and more skeptical of so much of the published literature, especially in the humanities and the social science. And God damn it, these people, they had an opportunity to save me, to save themselves. So I found this trend that I think is so fascinating that no one else seems to give a shit about. And the trend is the following. So Google Scholar does a pretty good job of actually giving scholar profiles to even people who are dead. So like Marx and Popper and Schopenhauer, and there's a bunch of philosophers and old school social scientists who you just type their name into Scholar and you can look at their profile. Okay. Yep. So I don't know what I was doing over Christmas break that prompted me to look at this, but early in the new year, I was going through some deceased philosophers and looking at their Google Scholar profiles because, you know, it's just curious to look at super influential people and be like, what was going on here?
Yeah. Where do you rank next to Foucault and Hegel?
Exactly. No, it's fascinating. Yeah. And even then comparing to Chomsky and the bigger names of today, you know, who's had more of an impact, you know, if you count sort of citation count as impact. Yeah. And it's kind of an interesting exercise. But I noticed the following interesting phenomenon. The vast majority of old school philosophers that I looked at, so Scholar plots the trends, you know, doesn't just give you the brute citation count, it plots how many citations you get by year, right? And so if you look at these, the vast majority have the following trend. They would increase over the course of their lives and then keep increasing after they were dead and peak in about 2018, 2019, and then almost without fail would start decreasing. And this is not just people who were born at similar times. This is Hegel, Marx, Popper. I think Wittgenstein was on there, Schopenhauer, social scientists like Emil Durkheim. So like anyone I could think of who had been super influential. I was looking at their citation profile and inevitably would peak 2018, 2019, sometimes 2020, and then decrease after that. And so 2024 for all of them, and I did this right at the beginning of 2025, so it had, you know, grabbed all the citations for 2024, and 2024, like almost inevitably monotonic decrease, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024. And this would make sense if they had been active maybe in the same era or something. But no, this spans centuries in some cases. Kant is another one. And so I was trying to think to myself, like, what's going on here? Like, is this, you know, when you look at something systemic like this, you have to just ask yourself, is this reporting bias? Like, is this on Google's end somehow? Like, what, you know, maybe they changed how they were tracking citations or something like that. But I think we would have heard about that, you know, because, you know, a lot of modern day scholars use Google Scholar quite seriously to track impact and whatnot. So if they had drastically changed how they report citations, I think that would have trickled down to the likes of PhD students like us. And so I was just kind of baffled when I saw this. And I have one or two explanations that I now think might be the case for what's going on. But I'm curious, just off the top of your head, if any reason jumps to mind.
Great. What a great puzzle to open the episode with. So my first thought would be something to do with like philosophy departments and just like norms around like mass citations and stuff. But I'd want to see if it is only philosophy departments that have this effect. Like, what are some big social psychologists or something? I guess you said Durkheim, right?
Durkheim was one. And I just didn't know social psychology as well. So admittedly, I checked fewer names there. But yeah.
But, so I'm trying to figure out if it's only big philosophers and they peak, or if it's like all of academia had like this massive citation frenzy thing happening that like, so 2020 is like when COVID began, I guess, right? So presumably people are publishing less and there's just like less productive work being done as everyone's moved indoors. I also want to maybe add in like the peak woke hypothesis a little bit, but could we do something with so could we do something with like Marx? Okay, that makes sense, but so maybe if it was just peak woke, like let's just use that, then it would be something like maybe all these philosophers are being cited, but most of them are being cited negatively. And so we could see if like the more wokey philosophers like Marx and Hegel and all them are being cited in the affirmative, and the other guys are being cited in the negative. And I guess peak woke hypothesis would also lead to like Foucault would probably spike pretty hard and all like the postmodern.
Foucault was another one who went down.
Yeah.
Went down. Yeah.
But so then who would not go down? Like if it was peak woke, then something like I don't know, maybe John McWhorter, or obviously bigger names than that, but like maybe non-woke kind of names would start to spike upwards a bit more. That would be
Kennedy will have a huge citation model. And I'm sure he did, right? He wrote like how to not be a baby or whatever. Not how to not be a baby. How to not be a racist baby or whatever he wrote. Yeah. So I'm sure he got lots of cites for that.
Don't be a racist whining baby.
Don't be a racist. Stop pooping your pants and stop being racist.
Stop raising racist babies.
Useless piece of shit.
That's so funny. Yeah, I guess I'd also want to just like read a few of the publications too. Like in 2019, what are they talking about? Like, are there certain ideas that are just for whatever reason? Like maybe they're all talking about the Increments podcast. Increments started around 2020.
Yeah, maybe we're getting citations. We don't even know
exactly.
It.
Yeah, maybe we're causing this upswing.
Our H index is
huge. So did you click on any of the publications at all before you give me the answer? Give me what your
well, that's sort of that's a difficult experiment to run because we're talking about like these are super influential people. We're talking about people who are getting like 20,000 citations a year, sort of thing. So this is like going down from 2018 they're getting 20,000 citations, and then by 2024 they're getting like 10,000 or 15,000 or something. So these are big numbers. So it's hard to get a sense of what's going on in modern day literature by just looking at who's citing those papers, I think. And like, I didn't want to dig through a bunch of sociology and philosophy papers. So yeah, my research did not extend that far, to be fair. But I think, so the issue with peak woke is that I think there's two issues. So you might just posit that, okay, it's less cool to now cite like old white dead philosophers now. Like that's just sort of the norm in these departments. And so maybe that's why people like Foucault are also being cited less.
Oh, I need to clarify something. I kind of screwed up the timeline. Peak woke. This would have been not peak woke. This would have been like when woke is ascending, right? This was like before George Floyd.
Well, it depends what you count as peak woke. I would say like 2020, 2021 is peak woke probably. So you're right. I would say this happened like a little bit before that. So this is like as we're really ramping up towards peak woke. Okay. It starts to descend. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I just realized my timeline was kind of shot.
But to be fair, I think when people say peak woke, we normally mean in the culture at large, whereas in academia, a lot of these ideas were there earlier, right? So if you walked into an academic institution in 2018, it was pretty woke. And So, but I think the issue there is, I think I would claim we've seen wokeness decline.
Yeah, for sure.
And so you'd expect the citations to go just back up if this was a monocausal thing, right? Like, okay, if it's now cool again to cite these old white dudes, why wouldn't people be doing that? Unless it just changed the norms to such an extent that that's just now not okay anymore, and it's just not in the water that people do that. But I also would have expected the effect to be more heterogeneous, meaning people like Foucault, like you said, would still be cited a lot, and Marx would still be cited a lot, but other people would just not be cited as much. And so I wouldn't expect to see this sort of uniformly over a lot of these philosophers.
One of the things that I could see happening is that after, let's say, the woke fever started to break, the numbers of students signing up and enrolling for like philosophy and English and sociology and women's studies and stuff just is starting to go down.
Yeah, that's my other hypothesis, is that basically you're just seeing like a shrinking field. And a lot of people are moving over to like technical fields like computer science and stuff, right? There's obviously been a huge influx of people who want to do computer science and whatnot. Like it was much less cool before neural networks were hugely successful. It was way less cool to study computer science. And, so in like 2010, you're not going to have intro computer science classes that have 1,000 people. Now that's routine because so many people are trying to study computer science. So you might have just seen a shift in academic focus at large from the humanities to more technical subjects. And that would sort of track the citations of computer scientists, which we know have sort of exploded in the past few years, right? Like most active computer scientists have like you look at Michael Jordan's Google Scholar and it's sort of exploded since 2018. Yeah. So that's another possible explanation.
Yeah. I just looked into Perplexity, and it said over the last 20 years, the trend in undergraduate philosophy enrollments has been marked by fluctuations, with a significant decline from 2010 to 2016, followed by a modest recovery in the recent years.
Well, that's interesting. So if it's declined 2010 to 2016, those are the people who would be graduate students and young professors now writing papers, right? Exactly. So if so now there's just fewer there's fewer academics publishing papers.
So I'm looking at
that's interesting.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the undergrads levels, and it says that it starts to decline or growth in 2010, then starts to decline in 2016, and so there's probably like a bit of a lag by a couple years.
Exactly.
So maybe that has something to do with it, but presumably it's not just philosophy, right? Maybe it's a lot of these soft sciences. And also, okay, but when did the whole replication crisis start too, right? Because there was like a whole overhauling of a lot of these like norms in psychology, and presumably there's been some ripple effects to like neighboring disciplines and stuff, but obviously it's not going to be monocausal. But it's interesting that the number of citations has declined. And does that correspond? Actually, here's another question: does that correspond just to the number of papers being published? Like, is just the sheer number of papers being?
Yeah, I don't know. You'd have to, I guess, look at the number of papers. Yeah.
Because
that's a good question.
That trend is just indicative of the sheer number of papers. Nothing more fancy.
But then you have to ask why there's like way few papers being published, and like it could just be the size of these departments, but it could also be some other reason. But I think looking at the number of papers published, and then also just how many professors there are in these disciplines, like tracking that over time would be pretty interesting. Anyway, I was just so fascinated by this when I first saw it. Like, what is going on here?
It kind of actually reminds me a little bit of, I was just listening to just 10 minutes before this, a podcast. 4 psychologists, 2 beers. I always 2 psychologists, 4 beers. With Adam Mastriani.
That's not a lot of beers for psychologists. Yeah. Poor bastards. Half a beer each.
2 psychologists, 4 beers. Yes. With Adam Mastriani, the guy who does experimental history, the brilliant blogger. He's amazing. And he was just kind of talking about his exit from academia, where like the further along he went on the standard path of like undergrad, grad school, prestigious postdoc, etc. That was like the standard path, and then he just veered wildly outwards because he realized, at least in psychology, as he was getting more developed, all the incentives were starting to just misalign in terms of like he talked less about funding and more about writing. Like I guess in some of the journals, like they just made him use words that weren't his own. And as someone who does some writing oneself, like I would rather jump. Do not make me use words that are not my own. That drives me crazy. And so he just veered out wildly and now is a successful blog. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because he talked a lot about just the negative incentives with academia, his flight from it. And now there just seems to be this interesting little pocket, like you and I is one little pocket. The Mastriani blog is another one. And there's just and podcasts and stuff, but people just doing independent science and putting it on the internet, and just like Sabrina Hofsfelder and stuff. And like if you, I can never pronounce her name properly.
We're keeping that in for sure.
Like if you just like doing science and you just like getting ideas out there, like YouTube has been an awesome place for that. Blogs are being an awesome place for that. And so to tie it back to what we were talking about earlier, maybe there's just like a flight from academia because you just teach on the internet. If you like teaching, just do it. Like I just read somewhere that like in the world, you can just do stuff. Like you don't have to. You don't have to follow a path. You can just do it.
No one's stopping you.
Just do things. If you want to put lectures online, then just put lectures online and see what happens. And so I don't know. Like maybe part of this bubble is just part of this like flight away from academia from a lot of academics who are realizing, kind of like I realized, that you can just do all the stuff you love in academia, but just on your own, and get a following and all that. And so I don't really know where I'm going with that, to be honest, but that's maybe part of a hypothesis, but also part of this, like, I'm excited for the future of more people independently figuring out how to contribute to, maybe we can call it like the ecology of epistemology, just like all of the various like researchers, and if you view it like an ecosystem, right? Like there's the bottom feeders and there's like the high lions, and then there's just the ecosystem of knowledge growth. And I'm excited about like these non-academic spots where this kind of interesting ideas are coming from.
I mean, no, I think that's right one to look at like broader cultural change that can explain this, because there's no way that these people just independently all stopped getting cited at the same time. So you're right. There was some big cultural shift, and the question is, what is that? Independent researchers and stuff. I agree, mostly excited, somewhat wary, right? I mean, if you just look at academia as an institution, it's hugely flawed in a huge number of ways, many of which we've discussed. But, you know, like many traditions, there is problem solving and wisdom built into the institution. So, you know, like peer review is a good idea when done well. And this independent ecosystem of researchers where a lot of it's just going to be built, you know, claims are going to be evaluated based on people's status, you know, how many Substack followers they have and stuff. There are huge downsides to that we're going to have to contend with, right? So we're going to have to innovate ways to do some sort of evaluation checking that plays something like the role of, and not always, right? Like, but when you want to start making formal claims about how the world works and stuff, we're going to have to figure out evaluation mechanisms that mimic in some way the role that peer review plays in academia. And, you know, that's not impossible to do. But I think as that ecosystem grows and traditional academia shrinks, if that trend continues, then, you know, we're going to have to figure out how to do something like that, because it is great to have tons of people feeding in their ideas to this thing and blog posts flying all over the place. And then you can, you know, filter them with Google and LLMs. And this is, you know, it's the era of connectivity, and that's all fantastic for idea generation. But we also, you know, need to be able to converge on what's true sometimes. And that's hard to do if it's just a billion Substack posts.
Yeah. Well, so Mastrioni has this brilliant idea. I'm sure, I don't know if it's original from him, but I use it in my thinking a lot, which is the difference between strong link problems and weak link problems. Maybe you're familiar with it. But just for the audience. So what's a strong link problem and what's a weak link problem? So a weak link problem is when the most important thing is to make sure that the worst of an example is not that bad. So you want to make the weakest link stronger. So for example, food quality. So it doesn't really matter how good the beluga caviar is. What matters a lot is that the lettuce doesn't have salmonella on it. So that's a weak link problem, because you want to make sure that the worst thing is as good as it can be. A strong link problem is where you don't really care about the worst thing. You want the best thing to be as good as it possibly can be. So it doesn't matter how many shitty bands there are, because you just aren't going to listen to them. But what matters is that you get like one or two Led Zeppelins and Pink Floyds and stuff. So strong link problems, you want the best to be as good as possible. You don't care about the worst. Weak link problems, you want the worst to be as good as possible, and you don't care about the best. And he makes a point that science is a strong link problem, not a weak link problem, because it doesn't really matter how many like little microblogs there are out there that no one's reading. What matters is that the best blogs are coming up with the best ideas, and the rest will just kind of be ignored and stuff. So too, you could maybe argue with academic publications, with the exception of like the citation incentive structure and the fact that if people want to be academics, there's only like a small number of positions, and so you don't want like the weak link people, the weak links to be like getting tenure and all that. But just on the comment of like coming up with systems that will filter out the bad ideas, like I think just human attention will do a good amount of that. Does that land for you? Like, do you think that we really need to worry too much about just microblogs and stuff, as long as the strongest blogs and the strongest ideas are being risen to the surface, or am I missing something?
So I think why science is a strong link problem is because true things tend to be useful. So if people are trying to build off of studies that aren't true and that doesn't go anywhere, then naturally they'll gravitate to the studies that are true or closer to truth, because they'll actually be able to build off of them. You know, someone makes a claim about the melting point of steel that's wrong, and you try and build off of that, then your experiments are going to go nowhere, and then you're slowly going to gravitate towards the other publications that have the correct melting point of steel, and you're going to actually be able to build off them. So it doesn't matter how many bad scientific ideas are floating around, because when people test them, we'll figure out that they don't actually withstand scrutiny, and naturally our gaze and our attention will be, will focus on the studies that are actually providing value, right? And we'll build off of those. And those are the strong links. And then everything that wasn't true sort of just gets laid off by the wayside slowly, right? And it's just sort of garbage we don't have to pay attention to. Now, if you don't have this sort of feedback mechanism, as I would argue you don't in maybe many like social sciences or some of the humanities, where people's interest is, it's not always guided as closely by just truth and usefulness. It's sometimes just guided by fad and fashion and ideology. Then having a bunch of bullshit out there where people are just claiming whatever they want, and you don't have some sort of error correction process like peer review. I can imagine just communities getting locked into like bizarre bubbles where it does matter that there's just a bunch of like patently false bullshit out there.
So speaking of bullshit out there where people just claim whatever they want, I think we should pivot to the subject of today, which is Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation.
Yeah, good. What a segue. Yeah. What a segue. Who's paying this man? He's on fire. Yeah. Totally ignores my point. Segues to Jonathan Haidt's book. That's
no, I completely agree with you. Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. Maybe fill up our drinks and dive in, unless there's any last thoughts on...
Let's do it, baby. Let's get in some fights. I'm getting anxious.
Go.
Oh, that was bad. That's so bad.
Welcome to another episode of Increments. I'm one half of your hosts, Vaden Masrani, a senior research scientist in machine learning, and my boy, my homie, this one's going to make me laugh, Benjamin, wine him, dine him, 69 him, chug.
Oh!
I like that. From Carnegie Mellon University.
I hope we have no adolescent listeners. This is getting spicy already. We're 1 minute in.
Oh, baby. You know when you like have a joke in mind and you think it's like so much funnier than anyone else thinks? Yeah. Sometimes I'll be like lying in bed and I'll think of something funny and I'll just laugh. And then Helena will think I'm a psycho because like she's trying to sleep and she's next to someone who's just laughing in bed.
The pumpernickel one has stuck in my head, to be honest. I always expect you to say pumpernickel. I don't know what it is. I'm half convinced that my own middle name is Pumpernickel at this point.
I have a big list of all the ones I've used because I don't want to like repeat them. I get such a kick out of this. It's so stupid. Yeah, so Increments podcast. Where are we? We're on Patreon. We're on Twitter. We're on YouTube, Discord. Come send us an email. Get into the Discord. Hang out. Write us reviews. All that good stuff.
Patreon, I guess.
Oh yeah, well I mentioned Patreon, but
oh, you did. Okay, yeah. Sorry, I zoned out there for a second.
That's right.
Yeah, if you want to be a patron, we have a bunch of extra Patreon-only episodes, 20 episodes at this point. Bi-weekly new episodes, either conversations between Vaden and I, or sometimes one of us in conversation with someone else. So sign up for basically the price of a cup of coffee, or you could, one-time donation us something more like the price of your leg, depending on how much value we bring to your life.
As much money as you possibly have to give. All right. Well, so today we are finally talking about Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation. I think both of us have been researching up a storm for this one. We haven't spilled our cards too soon, but the only thing I'll say before passing it off over to you is this is going to be one of these episodes where I just hate the book, man. I think it's terrible. I really don't like the book. Where you're gonna have to be the moderate voice of reason to like soften my blows, but just cards on the table. I did not like this book very much. That's where I'm at, and we have a lot to say about it. And so let's go. What are your thoughts? Where are we?
Wow, I couldn't have seen that coming. You disliked the book with a message that you disagree with.
What a surprise! What a surprise!
Well, maybe that's kind of interesting. Maybe. Let me ask you this. I mean, did anything, because I know you were skeptical about the claims going in before reading the book. That's sort of why you wanted to dig into this subject in the first place. Has your mind changed at all, or have you just come out on the exact same side?
Yes, mine's definitely changed in the sense that it looks like the spike of like cutting and female anxiety and like the rates of anxiety, like looks like the data that's true. That was a big surprise to me. So I wasn't sure if that was just like selectively just choosing some data. So that looks like it's true, and that needs to be explained. I was not convinced by his explanation. Nice. And so I went into the book thinking it was going to be much easier to critique, and it was much more challenging. it just created this whole fan effect of having to chase this paper and read this paper and find this data and that data. And so it was much more difficult to argue against than I thought, which was awesome because it was it was worth the challenge. And he presents some data that I wasn't aware of, and so I think that there is something to be explained here. I just don't buy his main thesis though. And I think that after diving into a lot of what he says and then what he cites to support what he says, I don't trust him as a scholar as much anymore. And we'll go into this in some detail, but that made me quite annoyed because he'll make some strong claims and then I'll read the paper that he uses to back up these claims and it is so flawed. And again, we'll go into all this, but that was kind of annoying because you just kind of expect that if you're an academic and you're publishing a book and you're citing, that I don't need to read your citations because I should be able to trust you, but I can't trust him anymore. And that was disheartening and kind of annoying.
Interesting, yeah. Yeah, I definitely take the other end of the stick from you on that point. I've been hugely impressed by the transparency of the entire project. I've never even heard of a social scientist who puts all of their research in a public Google Doc for people to know exactly what papers the claims are coming from, exactly where the numbers are coming from, makes all their analyses open to public so they can just rerun their analyses with. So they've put out a couple collaborative review docs, they call them, and these are huge 300-page Google Docs where they've invited criticism from other scholars. They're very they've just listed all the papers that they're citing. They've listed all the papers that have conclusions that don't agree with them, and so I think there are reasons to be skeptical of his analysis. I don't think there are many reasons to question his integrity as a scholar or a truth seeker. You can question his methods, I guess, without questioning his basic motives and stuff. And I view his reporting of the literature to not be dishonest in the way that I think you are. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think maybe you're alleging. He doesn't misreport the numbers, for instance, from specific studies. What he'll do is do sloppy techniques when it comes to meta-analysis or something, and things that, to be honest, I'm sure a lot of social scientists are doing because they're not, trained statisticians. And so we'll get into some of that. And I think there are valid reasons there to be extremely critical of the kinds of causal claims, especially that they're making, and that's good. And he needs to be criticized on that front. But that's very different than saying he's doing this on purpose. He's actively trying to mislead people. Yeah. I've never been more impressed, I think, with someone in terms of just their transparency out in the open. And I think if you were as careful about reading a lot of other scholars, even those that you like, as you were about reading him and chasing down his citations, I think you would find extremely similar behavioral patterns. Yeah.
So, okay, with regards to the Google Doc and stuff, for the audience, please check the show notes with this because I think both Ben and I are going to be saying a lot of things, and we are going to link to everything we are talking about. But check the show notes for everything. So there'll be show notes for the Google Doc and stuff. So when I first saw that Google Doc, that was when we first started arguing about social media 4 years ago or whatever. And that same Google Doc was being developed, and that was before the book had come out. And I was decently impressed back then, but I have a different view now, which is that you would not need such a Google Doc if the effect was real. If it was a effect of what's the effect of Ozempic on weight loss? You don't need that. You need a single figure that everyone agrees basically tells the story. But the fact that there is that many papers, this reminded me of this Alexander Pope quote, which is that words are like leaves, and where they most abound, much fruit of sense beneath is rarely found. Which is just this idea that the more words you have and the more stuff there is, that is itself indicative of very faint signal. You don't need that with does smoking cause cancer? Is alcohol?
Except we were confused about whether smoking caused cancer for a long time until a lot of people did a lot of meta-analyses exactly like this.
But after the proper study was done, you don't need all the rest of it. You just need one good study, and that is sufficient. But again, this is just a heuristic. This is just a sniff test, and we have to go into the details of each of the papers. I fully recognize.
So I suppose you're equally as cynical about Pinker's really long books that are trying to make a point, hey? He doesn't need so many words there. He should just point to the single study that does it all.
No, because the effect size are huge. Like, again, when I look at Pinker's data, like, so again, we'll go into the book and stuff, but Pinker doesn't do shady shit. He doesn't switch the metrics, like... Let's put a pin in this, because I think I need to substantiate a lot of what I'm saying by pointing to papers and pointing to like what kind of things I've noticed, at least, that I dislike. And with regards to the motives and stuff, no, I don't think he's intentionally. No, let me rephrase that. He knows he's coming in there with a bias. He says that outright. He says it at the beginning of his Google Doc that I have a bias. I am trying to follow the best principles of science. I'm eliciting criticism, and I'm being fully transparent, and that's all great. But it's just that his bias is showing based on how he describes certain works, which, upon reading them, I just don't agree with what he says. And it's like, you can be upfront about your bias, but if you still have evidence of your bias causing you to write things in your book and make strong claims, then I don't care that you've acknowledged it, because it's still causing harm, right? Like, acknowledging it should be one step towards getting rid of it, or at least trying to minimize its negative effects. But I have not seen that happen with a lot of the stuff in this book. So anyways.
I think this is just patently unfair, to be honest. Like, I think there's... Okay. Yeah. I think you need to be very clear about criticizing his statistical choices. I think, hiding a lot of your criticism is, like, implicitly there, what you're saying is he actually knows he's wrong, but he's writing the book anyway because, he has this bias, and the bias is overriding what he actually knows are a bunch of faulty studies. I just don't think that's true. I think he just would disagree with us about the object level claims about the soundness of the studies he's citing. I think he's being honest when he says he believes that social media is causing a mental health crisis among adolescents. And then what more do you want an honest scholar to do than make all his work public so people can criticize him, point to studies he's missed? He writes these after Babel Substacks, and then at the end of each one, we'll link to all the people who have written other posts criticizing him. Like, again, you just need to separate the question of whether he's wrong or right from the motives. And I think there's absolutely no reason to impugn his motives. In fact, I would love for every social scientist to take his lead and do research exactly like he's done it, in the sense of like making everything public, being very open and transparent, saying what your bias is beforehand. Like, yeah, I'm pretty allergic to impugning his motives here, because I think he's basically, and I think he's acting exactly as we want academics to act.
I'll have to re-listen to what I said, because if I said anything about his motives, let me just correct the record now, which is, I think he's sloppy, and I think he's biased. I don't think he is a liar, and I don't think that he's has bad motivations. I think that he knows what he wants to find. He thinks he's found it, and he staked his reputation on this. And I don't totally trust his scholarship, but that is not the same thing as thinking he's a liar or that he has bad motives. And if I said that earlier, let me just correct the record. I didn't mean to say that. I just don't trust his scholarship. I think he's sloppy. But sure. We need to let's just take that as a different views, and let's see how things go. But this is gonna be a fiery episode. Nice, that's great. We should set up for the audience. Like, so we've just jumped in, assuming that the audience knows what this book is about and knows what the whole thesis is, and we should not make that assumption. So I don't know. Do you want to kick things off?
Yeah, sure. So where are we at? Culturally is maybe one good place to start. So I think in 2018, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff wrote The Coddling of the American Mind. And this was basically pointing out that a certain generation had been raised in such a way to avoid confrontation, to be very emotionally sensitive. And this, in other words, they were talking about a major cause of wokeness, basically. And I actually haven't read that book. But at the end of that book, they start talking about various explanations for new behaviors that they were, at that point, we were seeing out of sort of the younger generation. And they posit that social media might have an effect here. They don't say conclusively, and they say things are very messy and we're not sure, but this is possible. And I think that that claim, that hypothesis piqued Haidt's interests. And then he spent the next couple years investigating that thesis and became more and more convinced that, okay, social media actually is a huge cause of this upswing in poor adolescent mental health, in adolescents' poor mental health. And yeah, like Vaden was saying, it's pretty hard to dispute just the numbers in something's going on in like teens and preteens with respect to their mental health. Anxiety levels are way up, depression levels are way up, suicides up. And so the question is really like, what's causing this? What on earth is going on here? Are these just normal fluctuations that, like every generation goes through? Or is there something more systematic at play? And importantly, is there something that we can do as a culture, whether it's policy wise or norm wise, to change this, to help people? And this mental health epidemic, Haidt likes to call it, is affecting girls more than boys. So young girls seem to be at higher risk of especially harmful and suicidal behaviors than young boys. So it's sort of, boys seem to be suffering in some ways, but it's sort of concentrated, especially among young girls. And the question is, why is this? And Haidt in the last few years has come out strongly on the side that social media is a major cause of this phenomenon, not the only cause, and not even the leading cause. So we'll talk, I'm sure, at some point about correlation coefficients and how much of the change in mental health he actually thinks is attributable to social media. But he thinks social media is a major cause of this, so much so that he now advocates policy changes. And so he's been writing about this, articles in The Atlantic, etc., for the past few years, and then sort of came out with the magnum opus, which encapsulates all his thinking on this topic in last year, actually, in 2024, I think.
24, 23, something very recently, yeah.
Pretty recently.
Yeah.
I think early 2024, perhaps. And this sort of summarizes the state of teen and adolescent mental health, lays out that there's a problem here. So, okay, maybe at this point we should just dive into the sections of the book, perhaps, and just say what's going on. So the book's sort of broken into several sections. The first just lays out the data, just, sort of trying to convince the reader that there is a problem to be solved here. The second part then actually takes a step back from social media and talks about what he calls the decline of the play-based childhood. Mm-hmm. And so this is actually just pointing out that parents in the last few decades have become pretty overprotective of their kids, and kids now are afforded much fewer freedoms than their parents had in terms of being able to play alone, being able to play outside, walk to the store, take on responsibility. And Haidt thinks this is a bad thing. Then part 3, he says this reduction in play-based childhood, this overprotectiveness when it comes to their physical safety, has now been paired with an underprotectiveness when it comes to their online safety. Mm-hmm. And now, so we already had this sort of decline. And he calls it the decline of the play-based childhood because the overprotective parenting means kids aren't exploring on their own anymore. They're not getting into fights. They're not playing. They're not learning how the world works for themselves because they're being shepherded through youth inappropriately by their parents. And then he says, okay, and then on top of this, we have the introduction of these very addictive social media apps that really got going in 2012, 2013. And then the rest of the book is trying to explain that this had a causal impact on adolescents' mental health. Mm-hmm. And then the book ends with some policy prescriptions, both policy at the level of government, like what should we do about this as a society, and then also ideas for how individual parents can handle this. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's a summary of sort of maybe the cultural moment we're in and the book. Anything you want to add there?
No, beautiful. Let me give credit where credit is due. I think that the second half of the book where he's talking about the overprotective parents and advocating for greater play, I'm totally in favor of all of that.
First half. Yeah, because it's part 2, the backstory is about that.
Yeah, okay, nice. Yeah, good. So in the first half where he's talking about the decline of play-based childhood and then advocating for more play, I think at one point, one of the policy recommendations he has is longer recess, open up the playgrounds before school starts. I'm in favor of all of that. That's great. I like all that stuff. Ironically, though, what he's doing is that he's rightly pointing out that parents in the early 90s we're like way too scared of the real world, and that the real world isn't nearly as dangerous as parents were taught. And he's trying to undo a lot of that damage, but he's replacing that with fear of the digital world. And I do not think that his causal claims are justified at all. We'll go into that. And for me, that's the nub of it, because the whole point is that it has to show the causal link. And the causal section, everything rides on that. And that was so weak. I'll be curious if we have a different interpretation. But for me, if that part was strong, then I would, I'd have to change my mind. Obviously, that would be fine. But also it would justify a lot of his rhetoric. And this is the other thing I wanted to maybe highlight, which is that before the book came out and after, he was engaged in a lot of online discussions with various bloggers and back and forth. And in some of these discussions, I'm sure, I haven't read all of them that you have read, but I'm sure he'll talk softly about correlation coefficients and how it's only one of a number of different factors. But I just want to contrast that to like some of the things he says just in the book as a way to demonstrate for the listener that he is not light on the rhetoric here. So he opens the book with a hypothetical experiment of some evil billionaire sending your 14-year-old to Mars against your will, and how all parents everywhere would freak out because their kids were being ripped away from them and being sent for this brain experiment. And he's like, oh, of course, that's a crazy scenario, but that is what's happening with Instagram and Snapchat and stuff. And then let me just give a couple samples. So companies that strive to maximize engagement by using psychological tricks to keep young people clicked were the worst offenders. They hooked children during vulnerable developmental stages while their brains were rapidly rewiring in response to incoming stimulation. This included social media companies, which inflicted their greatest damage on girls, and video game companies and pornography sites, which sank their hooks deepest into boys. What he says in a footnote there is that he includes as damaging to boys Tinder and Hinge and dating apps, which is hilarious because boys wouldn't use it if girls weren't on that too. But also to any listener who has used these, think, has this ruined your life or has it not ruined your life? Is it hooking its tentacles and hooks deepest into you every time you use these apps? Haidt thinks it is. And so keep that in mind, listener, because he, in an alternate world, could have written a book about that instead. And then he says, by designing a fire hose of addictive content that entered through the kids' eyes and ears, and by displacing physical play and in-person socializing, these companies have rewired childhood and changed human development on an almost imaginable scale. All right. Keep that in mind when we later learn about how softly he talks about correlation coefficients and stuff, okay? Because the rhetoric here is not matching what he'll say in a softer tone in a blog post that is going to be read by much fewer people because it's not on the New York Times bestseller list. So part of the reason I'm coming in here animated is because of this wild discrepancy between what parents are going to be listening to on an audiobook when they're picking their kids up from school, and what he'll say in like the 50th paragraph of a giant exchange with meta-analyses, and who the fuck's reading any of that stuff. The reason why I'm really interested in this subject is because a number of close friends of mine are really scared to give their kids screen time. And I don't think that that's justified. Obviously, I need to argue for my position. I haven't done that yet, and hopefully we will throughout the course of this conversation and perhaps some spillover conversations. But it matters to me because if it's not true, let's just say hypothetically, if Haidt is just wrong, just hypothetically, then we are depriving children of early access to a technology and to a skill set, which is navigating the digital realm adeptly. We're denying kids this very important learning opportunity. And so hypothetically, if, just to any parents listening out there, if Haidt was wrong, and it turned out to be that like denying kids screen time is kind of like denying kids a computer when all of your friends are learning how to use computers, and you're stunting their development because you're preventing them from learning a valuable skill set, what harm is that going to cause? I'm not saying that's true necessarily, but I'm saying that the stakes are high. The stakes are high. Even if it's not just about denying kids the opportunity to learn valuable skills, and it's just about like harmony in the household, because a screen is like a nice way to have reprieve as a parent for an hour. Even if it's just that, again, that would be worthwhile talking about. Like, for the record, with Georgia, just so people know, like she can have unlimited access to the iPad. What I've been doing is I like to make it challenging though. So she has to learn the password. And so she just figured out all her even numbers. And so as soon as she got her even numbers, I've switched the password to odd numbers. And as soon as she's age appropriate, I'm going to replace the iPad with like a MacBook Pro because I want her to learn how to use a computer. And so that's how we're approaching it kind of from a parenting perspective. But I just want to establish that the stakes are high because this will either mean you have a tantrum with your kid a couple times a week, or you have just peace and quiet and the ability to like do the laundry and go out with your partner and stuff. And so the stakes are high, which is why I'm very interested in this subject.
We're just going to be volleying multi-paragraph essays back and forth.
Before we even got into the freaking content here.
Yeah. No, that was great. And actually, I agree with a lot of that. And just to bolster your point a bit, he mentions the word correlation. So this is even putting aside causation. This is just the first question you'd ask is like, is there a correlation between social media and poor mental health outcomes? And so that, that's weaker than looking at causes. That's just like, do these things tend to rise together? And he mentions the word correlation, looks like twice in the main book, and only talks about the actual numbers, like what the actual correlation coefficients are in footnotes in the book. And so again, this is just, I guess, highlighting your point that he's less careful about hedging his language in the text and in, when he's writing articles for The Atlantic and stuff, and on podcasts too. I listened to a couple of his podcasts, and he's also less careful in his language there. So on the Jordan Harbinger show, which I just listened to this morning, he said there's absolutely no question now about the causation between poor mental health outcomes and social media. And so yeah, this is all to say, I agree with you. I think he's not being as careful as he should be in public when he talks about this. Again, I would certainly not go as far as to like impute motives and stuff. I think he does believe this, but I just think he's not being as careful as one ought to be. So, okay, a couple thoughts based on what you said. So he's aware of the potential irony of warning parents that they are being too overprotective in the real world, and then arguing that we need to be more protective online. He's aware that this is a seeming contrast at first, and he just, on his view, social media apps have been designed in such a way to hijack some of our mental processing systems to make them like uniquely dangerous. And so we can get more into that, but I guess I didn't want to leave the listener with the impression that this irony just totally escapes him throughout the course of the book, right? Like he's very much aware that he sort of frames this as like we've made two simultaneous mistakes. We've become way too overprotective in the realm in meat space in the physical world. And we've become way too underprotective when it comes to social media and their online world. And these are both huge mistakes. So we've sort of, done this simultaneous gaffe. And then with regard to you saying the stakes are high, I totally agree. And I think this is an extremely interesting case of when epistemology and how we think about truth seeking really interacts with concrete situations in the real world, right? So we have something that everyone seems to agree on who looks at the data. Like we do have a crisis in some sorts, right? Like especially among girls, I would say like we need to figure out what the hell's going on here.
I want to challenge that slightly, but in a second. Yeah. We'll keep going. Yep.
Sure. Like, yeah. Whatever language you put to it. I mean, I think there's been a huge rise in poor mental health outcomes. And so presumably we want to ask what's going on here and can we fix this somehow? We don't want this trend to continue. And then you have some people who claim that this is social media. And the question is, what should they do with this claim? And I do want people writing essays and making the case that it is social media so that other people can come along and criticize it, right? Like, I don't think it's appropriate to ask that we be 100% sure about every hypothesis before we start advancing it publicly. Now, I totally take your point that sometimes when he advances the thesis publicly, he's not as careful as he should be, right, in terms of caveats and stuff. But I still want someone like him to be making the strongest case possible that it is social media, so the rest of us can evaluate it. And so I guess I'm less I'm less harsh about his approach and his presentation in the book than you are, with the caveat that, yeah, when he's just like totally overplaying his hand, I'm against that. But I think this is just an interesting case where like we're kind of in the dark. We're not sure what's going on. Not many other theses have been advanced as to what the cause is. There have been some, and we'll get into those. And I think there are some interesting ones. But you know, it's I don't want to say it's an emergency, but we would like to know what's going on here because we want, you know, people to be as healthy and happy as possible. And there seems to be something that's making people less healthy and happy than is possible. And so it's just an interesting case of like, what do you do here when it's just sort of like mass confusion on either sides? And like the evidence is pretty weak for all sorts of claims. And, you know, like what do we do? Like, where do we go from here? Yeah. How do we navigate this? Maybe
this is a perfect place to now pivot to just like, what is the data showing? Let's not talk about the social media thing for now. Let's just talk about the rise in mental health.
Nice.
And the data that he presents. And then we'll go to the social media part after that. So for the listener, I don't know if you have the book in hand. Let's assume you don't. But the first chapter of the book is called The Tidal Wave, A Surge of Suffering, or The Surge of Suffering, in which he presents a number of interesting and, I'm going to say, at first pass, compelling figures. But I think that there's some more nuance here. So the first thing that he highlights is that, there's a wild rise in major depression amongst teens. So I would not say this is trivial. So between the years 2010 and 2016, the rates rose from about, let's say, 12% who report being depressed up to 20%. And that's higher for girls. For boys, it was like 5% to about 6 or 7%. Yeah, but then it keeps going up. Okay, so that is interesting. That's alarming. There's a couple things that could be said there. So it could be the case that just more people are talking about depression, which is a good thing, and then getting treated for depression. And so it's not that the actual rates of depression have gone up. It's that people are more aware of depression and are talking about it and are getting diagnosed for it more. So that's a possibility. This is all based on self-report. So then he says, okay, well, I know that self-report can be kind of inaccurate. So a much better metric, and I totally agree with him on this, is hospital admission rates due to self-harm. So due to cutting, due to swallowing poison, this kind of thing. And would you agree with my claim that tends to be a lot of what he hinges his, that's like the strongest evidence that there's a problem here, because the self-harm thing is kind of independent of the reporting and stuff? Or what are your thoughts on self-harm? Because that was something I was anchoring on pretty strongly in terms of like, that's the main thing that needs to be explained. But I'm curious if you agree or disagree.
I think it's pretty compelling. Like, okay, maybe I'm just less down about self-reports than you are, but the thing about self-reports is like, you're still asking the same questions over time. So even if there's a cultural influence, then, then you have to ask, well, like, what's causing the huge increase in the cultural influence here? And like, just consistent rates in increases of people reporting anxiety, depression, across like the Anglosphere and the Nordic countries and like basically all the Western countries where there's good data. I find that to be pretty compelling.
But I think it kind of cuts against like the global happiness index and stuff. Like, isn't there all sorts of world and data figures showing that people on average have been getting happier? And so you can self-report levels of happiness and stuff. I guess there's just so many confounding factors with the self-reports of depression thing that I don't know if an increase in self-reports of depression is actually a good thing, because now people are acknowledging that they're depressed and getting treatment for it, compared to just not even knowing that there's a name for something called depression and is being miserable all the time. So I guess I just don't know how to think about the self-report increase in depression and how that counter or goes for or against like life satisfaction data.
There's a couple things to say. Like, life satisfaction data is typically pooled, right? And so Haidt's big claim here is that things have actually been getting better for millennials and Gen X. No, what's the one above millennials? Gen Z? Boomers, I guess. Gen Z? Yeah.
I always forget.
Whatever. So everything above millennials has actually been getting either stayed the same or getting better. And so a big criticism actually coming from Haidt leveraged at a lot of the social media studies is that they pool things together and they ask, is there an effect overall of social media on mental health? And he wants to say, no, this is the wrong question to be asking. You need to zoom in on adolescents. And in particular, you need to zoom in on adolescent women and see if there's a negative effect there. So it can be totally consistent to have rising overall happiness and declining teen happiness. That's very possible. Secondly, I haven't looked at the global happiness index for in this time period, and I don't know if it's actually increasing or not.
Well, let me send you some data, good sir, that shows non-pooled mean life satisfactions for 11-year-olds, 13-year-olds, and 15-year-olds across 20 or 30 different countries, including Canada, including Greenland, including Estonia, including Bulgaria, Croatia, and the United States. That shows it's basically plateaued, and that people have not been reporting that they're less happy with life over the exact periods of time that Haidt is saying things are getting tremendously worse. I'll just quickly share this on Discord. Nice. Okay, so this is from the Human Behavior in School-Age Children. So this is 2014, 2018, 2022. We see our age ranges 11, 13, and 15. For our audio-only listeners, switch over to YouTube because we will have this data. But if you look at figure 1.1, between 2014 and 2018, he's saying girls kind of skyrocket, but this is not showing that, is my only point.
Yeah, so what is this pooled over? This is
11, 13, and 15-year-olds. Girls are in green, boys are in blue. And we don't see a crazy decrease. You do see a more regular decrease between 2018 and 22, but that's largely due to COVID, I would argue. And that's like a noticeable signal in most places. But this is going to be a major sticking point for me, is that when I went and looked for my own data to support what he was saying, I would find very contradictory information. So this is just one.
Does he talk about this data anywhere?
I don't think so. No. Because this is just mean life satisfaction reports.
Okay, yeah, this is a great find. Yeah, I was mostly focused on his claims of causation, not the actual data. I sort of took his word that the data was pretty robust about the actual crisis, for lack of a better word, in teen mental health. But you're giving me reasons to doubt even that. So this is that's very interesting, and actually moves me closer to maybe your original position that he's a little sloppy maybe with respect to data sources. We'll see. Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I think you're probably overblowing the claims when it comes to causality, but we'll see. Yeah.
Sweet. So since we can share screen, this is going to be kind of awkward for the audience, but let's just do this for this episode and see if YouTubers will like it or not. So I just want to show, so emergency room visits for self-harm. Okay. So this is the thing that is for me, the most important data to understand and to try to explain. And I don't buy his screen time hypothesis, but I do buy that this is serious. However, let's kind of think about how serious it actually is. So the rate here is, let's say, so you drop 2 zeros, that's 2 out of 1,000. 2 out of 1,000 girls, 2 out of 1,000 boys. So that means if you have a school of 2,000 people, 1,000 of whom are girls, 2 of those girls in that school will cut themselves and go to the hospital for it. That is not trivial. That's 2 lives out of 1,000. That's something that needs to be addressed. If each of those girls tell one friend, now you have 4 girls at the school, and that puts us kind of to here. So the rise, the 200% that sounds scary, also needs to be thought about in absolute terms, which is we're talking about in 2010, there was 2 girls at a high school, and now at 2018 or 2020, it's 4 girls at a high school. Not trivial. We're still talking about real human lives, but we are not talking about 15, 20% increases in absolute terms. We're talking about it in relative terms. And that just, I think, is important to keep in mind. But what I want to focus on is how he changes the y-axis as he talks about this stuff. So when I first went into this book, I was like, okay, well, show me if what you're saying is true, man, then we should see emergency room visits for self-harm spike in all countries that have social media modulo a little bit of noise, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And I was expecting him not to show that, but he did. And so that was why I was like, oh, okay. It's the data is harder to combat than I thought. But then let's see what he actually does. So he has one for suicide, some other figures here, other figures here. And then later he talks about, so then he says, okay, but what about in the UK? So UK, we see the same thing. self-harm episodes for UK. Okay. Australia switches to mental health hospitalizations. So then I went looking because, again, self-harm rates are very easy to measure. So every hospital in the world is going to measure this. Like, it's not a difficult thing. So Australia does not show this. So you find the Australia one, please. So Australia decreases from 2016 to 2020. I'm just going to link to the data. It's probably not worth looking at the figures. So Australia decreases, which is why he switched here. And I'll share a link to that. The rest of the world. So then he claims that the rest of the world all has these same patterns. But again, Canada does not have this pattern. I can share data for that. Nor does France. I can share data for that as well. So that is why I think he's being slightly biased in a sketchy way here. Like, if he shouldn't need to change the y-axis of his figures while talking about how the same phenomenon is consistent across the Anglosphere. And as soon as I went looking for that data in places that he didn't report it, I found data going in the opposite direction. Because again, self-harm rates are not difficult to measure. That is a very easy thing for hospitals to measure. So the fact that he wasn't reporting that is like huge red flags.
Yeah, nice. So just to be clear, in Australia, you're claiming that self-harm rates actually went down in the relevant period.
Between the 2016 and 2020. Let me just pull up the data if you're rightly skeptical of that. So this is Australia's data. So intentional self-harm hospitalizations by age group. So we can look at the age range 20. So this is the 15 to 19 bracket.
Nice. Yeah.
And we can see that between 2014 and 2016, it rises, which is like what he was saying, but then it decreases sharply. But social media didn't disappear then. And in all his other figures, he's looking for figures that go just up stratospherically, right? And I can also show you France and Australia as well.
Nice. I mean, if it's similar, yeah, I think that's fine. Let's not bore people to death. Nice. Yeah.
So I can show you France, and Ontario, because Canada's tracked all this too. And the story he's telling is not consistent. So he talks about the UK. Okay, the UK, you see the spike there. But just think about how many degrees of freedom he has. So he has, 40, 50 Western countries he can find. Most of them, I'm imagining, are going to be looking for this kind of thing. He has hundreds of different mental health measures that he could find, right? So depression rates, cutting rates, just self-report, blah, blah, blah. And then he just finds ones that have curves in agreement with the American curve. Yeah. This is part of the reason why I don't trust his work. Nice. That is different than saying I am impugning his motives. I just want to be very clear that if I'm saying someone's sloppy, that is not the same thing as saying they're duplicitous or they're lying or that their motives are evil. It's just that they're sloppy. And this kind of data science of like looking for the signal that you want and coming up with post hoc rationalizations, we all do this. It's very easy to do. And the fact that someone's doing this is not because they're evil. It's just because they're making mistakes. And Haidt, I claim, is making mistakes, which is why it requires a fucking 1,000-page Google Doc because like if you don't have a lot of signal, then what you can sure as hell do is just add every study that has ever been written about the subject at hand and then tally. But I'll go into the studies, and the methodology for the majority of the studies are bad. And this is like, I wouldn't make the claim that this is explanationless science, because clearly he's offering explanation, but it's kind of veering towards that, which is just like counting studies and seeing how many say it's bad and seeing how many it says it's good. That is just not a robust way to think about a lot of this stuff.
Nice. No, that's very convincing. Yeah, I mean, even most of the criticism I had seen levied against him, like no one seemed to be questioning that there like is something going on here among adolescents. So your claim that there's possibly not is like worthy of consideration. I'll have to do
globe. Uniformly across the globe. That's like, so there. It's happening in the UK. It's happening in the United States. It's happening in places. It's just not happening uniformly where social media was released in the clean way that he's saying it is. Very interesting, compelling at first glance. I'll have to dive into it, but I think that's a super nice insight, and kudos for doing the deep dive on the data. So that's great. Recausality, I think we'll probably mostly agree here, maybe with some nuances, but I think he's also overclaiming the causality, and like we get into just this messy study counting methodology, which is certainly not robust. Well, it's not robust
if you have bad studies. It's fine and robust if you have a bunch of good studies, assuming you're weighting them appropriately. But we're not in that world. We're not in the world where scholars are being... And like, God, man, like just on a meta note, diving into some of these studies, you know, I was already skeptical. Like my trajectory has basically been naively pro-science from, I don't know, after undergrad or something, just being like, we can study this, like, let's do it. And then since then, I've just been on a trajectory of getting more and more suspicious, more and more skeptical of so much of the published literature, especially in the humanities and the social science. And God damn it, these people, they had an opportunity to save me, to save themselves. They had an opportunity to like do good research on a question that mattered. And I could hypothetically have come away from this being like, there's people who like, they know what they're doing and they're smart and they're running good studies and they're very careful. And like this is Haidt aside. These are just the studies he's looking into. Holy fuck, it's a zoo out there. It's just embarrassing. It's genuinely embarrassing. And like, this has done absolutely nothing for my confidence in the robustness of social science. I think my a priori assumption now is just like a study, they're all bullshit. They're all bullshit until they're all wrong until you prove that they're right in some sense. Like you have to go in super skeptical and then do your research, and like maybe a couple of them will turn out to be good. And again, I'm just saying all this without backing it up, and we'll get into some of the methodology, but like I'm just so disappointed in the whole system here. Like it's just such clear like publication incentives and stuff, and like people are just, it's just embarrassing. I'm just embarrassed. I don't know. The whole thing is just a mess. Like it sucks. It just sucks that it's this hard to answer these questions. That's what's annoying. Even from Haidt's perspective, like he, you know, okay, so suppose he's wrong, right? Mm-hmm. He'd want to know that as early as possible, presumably, right? Like, so if there was a bunch of very clear, well-powered, well-analyzed, rigorous studies that were very clear about like the causal effect and studied it appropriately, it would be super easy for him to not be convinced by a bunch of shitty data. But because it's such a mess, it is easy to convince yourself in any direction you want here, basically. And that's a shame. That's a shame. And it's like shame on these researchers, to be honest. Like it's just, I don't know, at some point you got to have some integrity in the things you're publishing. I don't know, like maybe that's a little harsh, but like you're fucking adults, like pull it together. Seriously. Like you're professional academics. Like it's embarrassing. Oh yeah. God.
Yeah, dude. I completely agree. I think so. Let's go into the causality stuff, because again, everything hinges on that. For the listener who's reading along at home, this is on page 157, 158. And it is literally half of a page, maybe just a page. Is social media a cause or just a correlate? So I'm going to read Haidt's own description of why causality is so important to establish. So correlational studies are always open to multiple interpretations. There could be reverse correlation, in which depression drives girls to use social media rather than the other way around, which is a hugely important possibility here. Yes. There could be a third variable, such as genetics or overly permissive parenting or loneliness, that causes both. To establish that one thing caused another to happen, the main tool scientists use is an experiment in which some people are randomly assigned to receive a treatment and other people are randomly assigned to be in the control group. Experiments like this are sometimes referred to as RCTs. Yes, RCTs. Okay, so just a meta comment. Like, this is what I find frustrating about Haidt, is that is absolutely right. So, like, beautiful. He understands the importance of showing causality. He understands what RCTs are. What would like a convincing RCT look like? Let's just think through this together, because I want to establish for the listener like what a good study would look like, and then we'll talk about what he actually cites. So, what a good study would look like? I'm curious if you agree with this or not. Something like the following. So, you let's say you have some money. Let's say that's government funded. We could talk about realistic constraints with academia later, but let's say it's government funded. And let's say you randomly reach out to 30,000 people in the United States. And you say to them, okay, we want to do a study. And what we're going to do is we're going to give you some money, or we're going to incentivize you in some way. And we want you to deactivate entirely your social media accounts. So Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all of them. We want you to deactivate all of them, let's say for 6 months. And we're going to follow you through, let's say, a year or a year and a half, 2 years. And we're going to check in weekly and look at various measures of mental health. So that study, as described, would be not blinded, still learn some stuff, but it's not blinded because the participants know if they're in the control group or in the treatment group. They know, and they know what the point of the study is. So one way you might try to single blind the study would be to give the participants some sort of story. Let's say that the story is we're trying to study the effect of like smartphones or going outside more. So you give them some sort of like fake thing because you don't want them to know what the research question is. That'd be single blind. And then a double blind study would be you do that. And then as well, you take the people who are like analyzing the data and they don't know which the control group is and which the treatment group is. And they're just kind of blinded there. So that would be maybe the gold standard with a few caveats. Do you have any corrections to that?
Yeah, so there's actually a couple interesting things to say here. One is that, you single blind, I mean, like there's it's still not... It's still challenging because it's not single blind in the sense that the participants don't know what they're being assigned to. They still know the assignment. They know whether they're being asked to get off social media. They might not know the reason, but that's not quite what single blind means. So there is this just inherent bias. And also we should show it's pretty well documented that people know that if they're in a treatment group for a study, they're sort of motivated to give the respondents what they think they're after. And so that's something that you always have to keep in the back of your head. So no study along these lines can really be single blinded because you can't, for instance, like in medicine, right? What you do is give half the group the true medicine. Say you're testing whether a pill reduces obesity or something. So you give half the group the real pill and you give half of them a sugar pill, just some placebo, right? So the participants are really in the dark with respect to what treatment they're getting. That's truly single blind. With social media, it's you can tell them you're studying a different outcome, but they still know if they're on social media the same amount or less, right? So it's not truly single blinded in that case, which poses some problems. So that sort of is a reason to be skeptical of some of the findings of these studies. But we should also say that, so how you've described RCTs there, those all fit under the umbrella or what are called dose response studies. So you're studying individual level effects of some treatment, namely how much time they're spending on social media. Now, Haidt's claim is actually more that there are social network effects of a bunch of people being on social media. Studying individuals won't actually necessarily give you the right results if it's actually a network effect. So let me just make this more concrete. Suppose it's true that social media is really damaging mental health. And suppose it's for the reason that because when everyone's on social media, they're interacting less and they're all online simultaneously. Okay. So now you take say you take one person and you remove them and you say you get off social media. Okay. But all their friends are still on social media. So even if they're off social media, you probably actually won't see a huge improvement in their mental health because now they're just going to be lonely sitting in their room and they can't even interact with their friends on, Snapchat or whatever, right? And so in this way, this sort of dose intervention, studying in the individual level effects actually won't show you what's really going on. And so this is just a challenge with the claims being made here of what you can actually study. You can try and get around this with natural experiments. And in this case, that would mostly look like studying different places where social media was rolled out at different times. So say Snapchat became really popular in Ireland 2 years after it became really popular in the US, right? And then you'd say, okay, was there a 2-year lag in these poor mental health outcomes in Ireland as the US, right? And so that would be a natural experiment and a different way to study this. Which
surely Haidt et al. Looked for and couldn't find.
No, he talks about this on his Substack.
Oh, does he talk about it? Oh, does he? Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Actually, what does he say? What does he say about that?
So he gives some examples of studies that he thinks sort of make the point. There's not that many. There's, I think, 3 studies of people looking at natural experiments of this sort. The issue is So, and then Stuart Ritchie actually wrote a good blog post where he criticized Haidt's interpretations of this. So, and again, I'm sort of more on Ritchie's side here. Admittedly, there's just not that many natural experiments to look at, so it's challenging from both sides. The main issue, as you might expect, is that high-speed internet did hit different parts of the globe at different times. So if you're trying to look at like the effect of the internet only, then that would be much easier to study. But once most places have high-speed internet, when social media got popular, when Facebook got popular, it sort of happened like relatively simultaneously all over the world. There just wasn't a huge lag between like when it got popular in the Western world, at least. There wasn't a huge lag when it got popular in the UK and the US. So you have to try and be really clever about like exactly what you're looking at and like make all these assumptions and stuff. And so it's just, that's also difficult to study. So I guess my point is that Haidt focuses mostly on dose response stuff because one, that's easiest for academics to study, right? You can take a group of undergrads and tell half of them to get off social media, fine. But I guess I just want to issue the caveat that like if Haidt is right and the drawbacks of social media are being made manifest at a network level, then dose response studies can like really underestimate those effects. And so again, that's not an argument that they are necessarily underestimating those effects, but it's just sort of a drawback of the world we're in right now, where it's just like hard to study this phenomenon directly.
And I wouldn't want to be misinterpreted. I'm not saying this. I don't think you're saying that unless a study meets all these criteria, it's strictly worthless. I'm more saying, I think you're saying too, but please correct me if I'm misunderstanding, that like this is just an intrinsically difficult thing to study. And so like given all these limitations, the best we could probably do is something approximating what I described with like, you can't fully blind, you can maybe come up with some alibi, maybe the alibi isn't even that good, maybe you can't even single blind, you could probably still single blind the researchers or whatever. Accounting for all these real world difficulties, if we saw signals there that would indicate that there's something interesting, and it wouldn't necessarily be conclusive, but it would still like change my mind for sure. So just to kind of summarize what I would consider to be like a reasonable gold standard, given the limitations of the difficult thing that we're trying to study, is some sort of like 6 to 12 month longitudinal study, fully deactivating all social media accounts, random sampling across the United States, and a sample size of, I don't know, north of like 2,000, 3,000-ish, like I'm not trying to be crazy, like you have to have a $20 million budget, but that would be like a study that I would take seriously. Would you agree roughly with that?
With the added desiderata that I think you'd want it to be deactivated at a group level. So you'd want to like take everyone in a junior high or a high school and say like they're all deactivating their social media. So that's how you can counteract the network effects a bit. So you say like, okay, you're off social media, so are all your friends. Okay, now we're going to do that to 10 communities, not do that to 10 communities. Then we'll look at like how everyone in this school is faring in 12 months or something. Yeah.
I always want to be careful using the word ironic, but I think we could say it's ironic that this bad book is going to create the exact studies that we are saying should have been in the book in the first place, because schools in Alberta and Australia and in some places in the United States are basically having these social media phone blackout policies. And so I am kind of kvetching about the quality of the work here, but in about 5 or 6 years, there will be these natural experiments and data that can be analyzed and stuff. Yeah. And hopefully these schools are looking at students' mental health.
Just in time for you to make a decision about Georgia, I guess, whether she gets a phone or not. Perfect.
Okay, so this is like to refocus back onto the book. So this is like the key thing that he has to show. Okay, so he talks about 2 experiments, two studies. So let me describe the study as he described it, and then let me describe the study as the discussion section in the study describes it. So he gives 2 experiments to establish causality, and this is like the thing that he's going to talk about throughout the rest of the book, is that it's not just correlative, it's causal. So, for example, one study randomly assigned college students to greatly reduce the use of social media platforms, or not reduce, for the control group, and then measured their depressive symptoms 3 weeks later. The authors reported that the limited use group showed significant reductions in loneliness and depression over 3 weeks compared to the control group. Another study randomly assigned teen girls to be exposed to selfies taken from Instagram either in their original state or after modification by the experimenters to be extra attractive. Results showed that exposure to manipulated Instagram photos directly led to lower body image. Taken as a whole, the dozens of experiments that Gene Twenge, Zach Rausch, and I have collected... Thank you, Twenge, Zach Rausch, and I have collected, confirm and extend the patterns found in these correlational studies. Social media is a cause of anxiety, depression, and other ailments, not just a correlate, with cause and correlate being italicized because that's really important for him to establish. All right, so let's look at the actual studies now. So I'm going to link to both of these studies because there are some very important things that he did not include in his description of said studies. So the first study he talks about is called No More FOMO, Limiting Social Media Decreases Loneliness and Depression by Melissa G. Hunt, Rachel Marks, Courtney Lipston, and Jordan Young from the University of Pennsylvania. We'll link to all of this. So for listeners who are going through studies themselves, I think that for these kind of studies themselves, I think that you should just basically skip to the discussion section where they talk about the limitations of said study. Because what didn't happen is a full social media blackout. What happened was that they were asked to reduce their use of Snapchat, Instagram, and Facebook only on their phone and only evidenced by looking at the app indicator, like time spent on each of these platforms. What they didn't do is didn't prevent the people from using like Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp or any of the social medias that were not included in the strict list that they were studying. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is that all the participants could use all of the social medias on their computers if they wanted to. So it wasn't deactivated. They could just not use their phone and just use their computer. Problem number three is that the students were participating in the study because they got extra credit, and the credit was given out before the study concluded. And after the credit was given out, I think they said something like 75% of all participants just stopped participating in the study. So what they're left with are those people who know that they're doing a study about social media, know that they want to get credit for it, and are the ones who are probably already bought into the study in the first place because they didn't just bail as soon as the credit was given out. Further, the whole thing is about the effect of social media on loneliness and depression. That's why it's called No More FOMO. But they asked all the participants like 8 different questions, of which one of them was FOMO, and the other 6 or 7 were just not statistically significant. So they asked the questions about, in the survey, they had a social support question, a fear of missing out question, a loneliness question, an anxiety question, a depression question, a self-esteem question, and a autonomy and self-acceptance question. The only one that seemed to be statistically significant was the FOMO one, which is obvious because social media is where you're going to find out where the parties are. So if you're not on social media as much, of course, you're going to be missing stuff out. And then they write a whole paper after the fact about that. This is not science. It should be practiced. And this does not establish causation at all. This is just shit science and the sample size was like 120 people or something, 143 people. 143 undergrads, so not the 10 to 14-year-olds that Haidt is saying are affected. And later he talks about how you don't see the effect with undergrads as much. You only see it with like 10 to 14-year-olds. Then he does a study with 143 undergrads. And and it's not even blacking out social media. It's limiting Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat to 10 minutes per platform per day on your iPhone. And you're still allowed to use it on your computer because there's no way to validate that you are or are not using it. And it's all for credit. And you're only studying this for about 3 weeks afterwards. And this is the example study he's put in his book to show causality. This is shit. This is terrible work. I'm sorry. This is why I am annoyed by Jonathan Haidt, because this is like, he's had that document for like, that document was starting to be written, the Google Doc thing, like when we did our first social media episode. So he's had that for probably 3 or 4 years before this book is published. And he went and he looked through all of that work. And from all that work, he chose the best study he could to put in his book. It was this one. And the fact that the best of the best is so poor is why I don't think he's shown causality at all, even a little bit. It's like, this is laughable. So I was going to go into the other study, but you had read a blogger who had also critiqued this study, and don't think I've read that blog. So maybe just I'd be curious if what I said kind of matched what this person said, or if because two people reaching independent conclusions on the same paper would be interesting to compare and contrast, I guess.
He cites very similar reasons for you. He points out that they studied like 5 or 6 things, but then only found significant effects for one of those things, namely loneliness and depression, as opposed to the other 5 things they studied. And, we'll definitely put this in the show notes. Peter Gray is someone I think who's worth paying attention to here, because he's aligned with Haidt when it comes to the play-based childhood. So Haidt has this nonprofit organization called Let Grow, I believe, that he founded, I think, right after the coddling of the American mind. And the idea is to push parents to like give their kids a little bit more autonomy and independence and let them take a little more risk so that they like grow up to be adults that can handle the real world. And I'm all in favor of this initiative. And one of the board members, or even one of the sort of co-creators of it, I believe, is this guy named Peter Gray. So with respect to like kids being coddled, Haidt and Gray are on the same team. And then Haidt came out with the Anxious Generation, and Gray, who has a Substack that's, again, we're subscribing to, wrote a critique of the book saying, it brings me sort of no joy to have to do this because we're colleagues, but I just don't buy the findings in the book. And so that's what caught my eye. I was like, okay, someone who's sort of incentivized to agree with Haidt in theory doesn't seem to. And that was interesting. And so anyway, he made a lot of the similar points you just made. He pointed out, like I pointed out earlier, that with these studies, you can't really make them single blind in any true way. And so the technical terms for these are like, you can't control for demand effects or placebo effects, demand effect being the effect I mentioned earlier, where students kind of know what the researcher wants to get out of it. Placebo meaning the students that are told to be off social media know they're being asked to be off social media. So you just can't control for any of these things. And so, anyway, Gray is very skeptical of the study. And since then has written a whole host of letters, he calls them. He calls each of his Substack posts a letter, which is kind of cool and makes it easy to keep track of, putting forward his own thesis as to like what's going on with respect to teen mental health, but also has been providing some data that was useful to frame the entire problem to me, namely looking at suicides and stuff. And he shows that suicides had a huge increase from 1950 to 1990. Especially among boys, sort of decreased then until 2010, which is in the US, I think, and then have increased again from 2010 to like 2020. And so when put in context like this, perhaps these have 2 totally distinct causes. Like perhaps the second spike is because of social media and the first spike is because of who knows what, the Cold War or something. But, when you see the timeline stretched out and you see that we've gone through waves like this before, it does start making you question like, okay, how much of this is actually unique to social media and how much of these are like broader, longer global phenomenon that are happening here. So anyway, we'll link to some of Peter Gray's stuff, but he basically made very similar points to what you're making.
Interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating that both of us reached the same kinds of conclusions exactly. So I just want to quickly say a few comments about the second of the 2 studies that Haidt is relying upon to substantiate his entire thesis here. Just to be clear about this, why these studies are important. This study is called Picture Perfect, the direct effect of manipulated Instagram photos on body image in adolescent girls. So in this study, all they do is they show girls photos of attractive women that either have or have not been photoshopped. They show some effect size. My main criticism here is this has nothing to do with Instagram. Like it's People Magazine. It's the same thing. There's no social component. The only
TV, like everything would have this.
TV. Yeah. And you just have to like scroll through the paper and just look at the photos. It's just the only relation to Instagram that this has is that the Instagram logo is on the top of the photo. Like it's just showing photoshopped and not photoshopped and then measuring some effect. Funny. But there's no social component. There's no chatting. There's nothing. It's just photos that have the Instagram logo at the top. That's it. And so it doesn't even really matter what the results are because they aren't showing anything with regards to Instagram. They're just like, if you watch TV, if you go look at a People magazine, if you go watch reality TV, if you are a person in the world at all, you're going to be exposed to this stuff. And the sample size is terrible and et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, let's just zoom out a little bit. why did I come out of the gate so strongly? It's because like when I first read the book, data was interesting, but I was like, okay, just give me the causal stuff. Give me the causal stuff, because nothing really matters if you don't establish the causal stuff. And the whole giant Google Doc, again, yeah, it can appear like he's being careful, and he kind of is. But if out of this giant Google Doc, the strongest stuff he could show is what he put in his book, the rest of the doc is just noise. It's just noise for distraction. It's because you're looking for signal amongst papers that have 100 participants that aren't blinded and that are longitudinally followed for like a week or 2 weeks after the effect. And you're not even removing social media. You're making some social medias slightly harder to use because it's like tracked on your phone, but you're not tracking WhatsApp and like SMS and how much social media is just through Facebook Messenger. Like none of that is being tracked here at all. But yet sweeping claims about the effects of all social medias are being promulgated based on these findings. This is not serious scholarship.
Excellent.
Sorry for that.
No, that's great. I mean, so yeah, this is time for me to admit when it came to the story about like how social media is doing this, I basically jumped to his Substack, where I know most of the controversy is, because I know that's where he like went into most detail about effect sizes, what study he's using. You know, he's basically trying to do a meta-analysis of the literature. So I just shifted at that point my attention from the book to his Substack and then went down a rabbit hole there. And now I'm just so curious what was going through his mind when he wrote the book. So to only cite 2 studies when afterwards, and like we'll get into criticism of his more detailed claims about causation as well, but to like, so you write this book, you only talk about 2 studies, but then you write a whole Substack about like, you know, making very detailed causal claims. I'm a little confused about what happened there. So I guess the most sympathetic reading, I guess, is that he just felt or like maybe editors even, like Popular Science book, you can't do a huge deep dive into causation. You need to pick like 1 or 2 studies, talk about them, and then shove a bunch of stuff in the footnotes, which he does. He does, you know, talk about other studies and actual coefficients and stuff in the footnotes. That's the most sympathetic reading. The less sympathetic reading is that he was, you know, convinced himself by these 2 studies, wrote the book, and then wrote the Substack after, just like in post hoc rationalization mode, trying to justify causation. That one seems a little less likely because he he knew about all these other studies because of this giant Google Doc, right? And so, but I'm just confused. Like, why wouldn't he include these details in the main part of the book? Like, when he'd done all this work anyway for the Substack post. Like, I'm confused about what he was thinking here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So on that. So like, why did he only report a couple things in his book? Like, he does report data that goes against his thesis, but he does it in kind of like a funny way, which is, it smells to me as someone who's written a paper and then got results like at the late stage of the paper that I don't want. Then I have to write around that and just like include it in such a way that is not comfortable for my thesis. And so one of those results, I think, is a 2023 Pew report where Pew just asked kids, do they like social media? And to me, that is a much stronger signal. Like, again, you could make a claim like, well, heroin addicts would say they would like heroin and stuff. And so I understand that self-reports are problematic in some cases, but we should at least be aware of that. So we should at least be aware of what kids say when you just ask them. Is social media making your life better or is it making your life worse? Right? So this is what he says. So he says, for instance, a 2023 Pew report found that 58% of teenagers reported that social media helps them feel more accepted. 71% saw it as a creative outlet. 80% felt more in touch with their friends' lives. Following on, a 2023 Common Sense Media report found that 73% of girls reported having fun daily on TikTok, and 34% said that their lives would be worse if they did not have access to the platform. 63% of girls say that they have fun daily on Instagram, with 21% saying their lives would be worse without it. Okay, so back to like the self-harm. So in a school of 1,000 kids, we've gone from 2 kids cutting themselves to 4 kids cutting themselves. But 800 kids all say that they are super stoked to have Instagram, that they find it to be a super fun creative outlet, that they felt more in touch with their friends' lives. So like the magnitudes of the effects here are not even comparable a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question to what extent he needs to wrestle with whether kids think it's beneficial to them overall. Because you can imagine him saying, yeah, of course the kids think it's beneficial for them. But there's just these long-term effects that they're unaware of in each moment that overall, like, it's bad for them, right? Is don't know that. So like any sort of, I mean, and these are the same claims that would have been made for like violent video games or anything like that. Like, of course, in the moment, the kid is on the platform and likes it. But the question is that good for them overall? Okay, so yeah, let's just step back a bit. So he's making these causal claims about the effect of social media on adolescent mental health in the book. The two studies he relies on seem sketchy at best. You know, because this conversation is continued, he has all these Substack posts about causation as well. And so the conversation between academics has continued and spilled over onto that. And there have been volleys of blog posts back and forth. I think at some point I'm going to write some sort of detailed overview of what I take the lessons to be in this battle of the blog posts. But I think the technicalities are probably not worth getting into here. I think at a high level, my main criticism of Haidt's methodology is as follows. And we've touched on this, right? So basically he has this giant universe of studies that he's pulling from, which, again, I'm glad he put this review doc together. It's good to be aware of all the literature out there, but that doesn't mean that what you do once you have all these studies is simply like count up how many studies find a negative association or causal relationship between social media and mental health, and how many find a positive one, and then side with the side with the winner. So you don't just count them up and side with the winner, but you also don't just combine them naively. Like doing a proper combining studies is a technique, is a statistical technique, and we do legit meta-analyses to do this properly, and doing it naively results in a lot of false positives. And so I think I've just been unimpressed by how Haidt has chosen to aggregate the results of all these studies, mainly because there's a lot of shit studies, like we've been saying, right? And so if you have this pool of, hundreds of studies, but most of them suck, that you should actually just toss them out. Then you shouldn't be including them in
Get rid of them from the Google Doc. Exactly. Get rid of them.
Or like keep them there, but saying we're not counting these because of all these problems, right?
Yeah.
So in a world, and unfortunately we're in this world because academia sucks for whatever reason, we're in a world where most studies are shit. And so in that world, you should not be trying to include them in your meta-analysis. You should just be discarding them. You should be focusing on rigorous, high-powered studies. Arguably, there just are no rigorous high-powered studies on this topic, so presumably that was, difficult for him to do. So he had to resort to this sort of bean counting type technique. Yep. But that just leads itself into all sorts of problems. And so, the volleys of blog posts back and forth have mostly been about that. There have also been some people that, have just been citing certain meta-analyses that claim to not find anything significant. Haidt's response to these is usually, and I think this is valid in some way, like most of these meta-analyses end up focusing on, like the effects of social media on everyone or adolescents as an entire group, and doesn't do like any sort of cohort effects where they look at girls in particular. And so I think that is a good criticism by Haidt, and is something that future researchers studying this question should be aware of, right? Like you should be looking at treatment effects at the level of age groups and gender groups. Because we have reason to suspect that the effects are different, right? But I think my overall takeaway is just that Haidt, doesn't have the evidence to back up his claims here. And why is this relevant? It's relevant because he's arguing for public policy prescriptions, again, like we were saying before. Exactly. And so if you're arguing that the government needs to step in and enact legislation that curtails people's right to do things, namely sign up for social media accounts, then you should have pretty robust research backing up your finding. And again, this isn't even to say that he's wrong. It's just to say that the evidence he's providing right now is just not strong enough to warrant such a strong call for like government intervention into our lives. I'm enough of a libertarian to believe the government should really only intervene when it's absolutely necessary. And I just don't think he's met the burden of proof required to ask for serious government intervention into our lives. That being said, I also don't think the state of the evidence is such that we can tell parents there's absolutely no problem here. Let your kids do whatever they want. Screen time, it's not going to harm them. I don't think we can claim that either. I think we're just uncertain enough where we have to be honest with parents and we have to tell them, unfortunately, we don't really know. We don't know about short-term effects. We don't really know about long-term effects. And this is kind of up to you. Like, as a parent who's just interacting with your kid every day, I think, parents are not in the dark as to if something's making their kid miserable or having a devastating impact on their lives, right? And I don't doubt that for some kids, social media is super addictive and super bad for their mental health. And I think we're just in the land where social media has a heterogeneous effect on people and not, it's not going to be bad for everyone and it's not going to be good for everyone. And I don't know what percentage we're at. It's possible it's really good for 20% of people, bad for 80% of people. And that's why we're seeing averages be roughly 0 or something, right? Or it's possible it's, great for 50, poor for 50. And we need to figure that out, right? And so that's going to go beyond just studying averages. We need to bring in covariates and try and understand what makes some people react negatively to social media, what makes some people react positively. Is this a cultural thing, a genetic thing? We need to figure out what those factors are. But before we know that, I think we basically just need to leave this in the hands of parents and trust that parents have their kids' best interests at heart. Where you could go with this is you could say, Haidt's wrong. Therefore, any parent that is trying to limit their kids' social media use at all is totally out of line. And I don't want to take that stance either. I want to say this is really up to the parents and I don't know. And if the parents think that limiting social media time is going to be good for their kids, then I certainly don't want to get in the way of that. But I just don't want to I'm certainly not on the side of people saying we know that this is a big enough emergency that we need to get government to put pressure on companies to start making sure no one can be on social media till they're 16 or 18 or whatever, right? Yeah, we're just not at that point yet. And so I think we just need to trust in parents and kids to sort of make their own decisions.
Yeah, beautiful, man. Yeah, I think that's a nice place to start winding things down. So I am a parent, and in terms of what I think with regards to screen time and social media, Georgia can use the iPad as much as she wants, but she gets bored of it after half an hour. She is just as into a balloon and playing Bop the Balloon as she is an iPad. And just I get bored of doing anything for a while, she does too. So with regards to what, because people have asked okay, so fine, iPad now, but when she's 14, what are you going to do and stuff? And I'm just going to tell her about this. I'm going to tell her about all the things we talked about, which is that a lot of the stuff that he's saying definitely happens. If we just soften it to, it could happen. Of course, looking at Instagram could give you body dysmorphia or make you feel lesser than and cyberbullying and stuff. Of course, that could possibly happen. Another thing that could happen is that you could meet some really cool new people and go to a party and meet the person of your dreams and then go to Thailand and just have an awesome, sick life. Things could happen in both directions. But so much of the effect of social media, I think, can be counteracted by just having a good relationship with your kids such that they feel comfortable talking to you if they are being bullied, and you feel comfortable telling them, here are the things to be aware of with regards to social media. Your people are going to show very selective images about themselves. They're not going to show all the bad parts. And 14-year-olds aren't idiots. You just talk to them. And when I taught guitar for 10 years, you just have conversations with them. You don't have to only talk to the parents. They're kids. They're just talk to them. They're smart.
Yeah.
And with regards to Georgia, I don't want her to be scared of the digital world any more than I want her to be scared of the real world. And I want her to be skilled. I want her to be adept at navigating the nuances of online conversations. I want her to understand how to research stuff. I want her to understand how to use the terminal and to program. And if all of the parents around me are preventing their kids from using social media and from screen times, then George is going to have like a competitive edge because screen times and social media are not going away. And so I just want her to be good at it. And compared to the approach of like, let's just hold this back from them because they're not ready. And then maybe when they're 19, they'll be old enough. Well, no, you're stunting their development. Like they will be much better at 14 if they know how to use it at 3.
Yeah.
And we talked once about what I like to call the virtue of suffering fallacy, which is like, if you have 2 ways to accomplish the same goal, one is like diet and exercise and grinding, and the other is Ozempic. Most people will just kind of feel bad about the easy path because there's some like weird virtue in like the difficult path. And I kind of think this goes back to like Christianity and stuff. It's similar with like so many women want to have birth without like an epidural, which to me is as fucking insane as wanting to get like a cavity without like Novocaine. Cavity filled without Novocaine? Sure, fine. But like that's just like the virtue of suffering. And I think that this manifests itself with regards to the screen time conversation, because it's easy to give your kid an iPad and let them entertain themselves for 45 minutes while you make dinner. And it's hard to like read them a book or like try to like stay engaged and multitask and stuff. And so parents feel guilty about the easy path. They feel like, oh, if I give them a screen, I'm like not doing my job as a parent. And fuck that. That is just a fallacy. There's no problem with having something easy and being less stressed and keeping an eye on like any negative consequences. Like, of course, there could be some kids for whom it's a big problem, but then when that problem arises, then you can deal with it. I don't think you should preemptively deny your kids and yourself something that they like and something that you like, which is like some time that you don't have to be fully on. And just with regards to like, what should you do as a parent thing, I think that the only thing you can do is run a little 3-week experiment. Just give your kid an iPad, see if they get bored of it, see if they turn into like a terrible demon monster. And if they do, it'll probably be reversible. Just take it away, and then you've run that experiment and you've learned, okay?
Yeah.
Like, don't trust Haidt, don't trust me, don't trust anybody. Just run the experiment, because a study is not going to be able to give you the information that you need, which is just observing your kid using the frickin' thing. And just try it yourself. Nothing is going to be so damaging that it's not reversible. You can take the iPad back to the frickin' store if you don't like it, but just try it. Just try it, see if it works. And don't succumb to the virtue of suffering fallacy, that because it makes their life better and it makes your life better as a parent, thus it must be bad, which I think is the underlying reason why this topic is so captivating for many people.
I mean, I'm just confused about this whole community, this whole research community is like, grant Haidt what he wants. Suppose causality is exactly as big as he claims, or it's as robust as he claims. Okay. What percentage of the variance are we talking here? Like, how much does this actually explain? So it's a cause of mental health. Now you have to ask, how big is the cause? And on that front, there's actually less disagreement, right? So now we're talking about correlation coefficients that are like between like 0.1 and 2, or 0.1 and 0.2. Okay. So you're explaining like 4 to 6% ish of the variance here. If you grant Haidt everything, right? So then the question is like, well, shouldn't you also be focused, like, you think there's a mental health epidemic, you found something that explains some of the variance, fine, and like you might even say that warrants public policy, like fine, like you know, the correlation coefficient for like lead in paint, or like lead causing lead poisoning. Yeah. What am I looking for? Lead paint, I guess.
Leaded gasoline. No, I think it's
leaded gasoline. Maybe
probably lead and everything.
That was pretty small too. So that was like 0.11 as R.
Oh, okay.
Right?
That's a great thing to keep.
Yeah.
In mind.
So smoking is like more like 0.5. But they're like the negative outcomes between like heroin and life outcome is like 0.19 or something. So we're like in that realm.
But wait, heroin's less than smoking? No, you said smoking.
Yeah. Heroin's less than smoking. Yeah. Like in terms of smoking and lung cancer, and then heroin and general life outcomes, I think.
Fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot of people that use heroin, like, and they're fine, right? You hear about the really bad cases, but there's people who use heroin. It's like, so anyway, but I guess the point is, like, so in the realm of public policy, like, you know, small effects can still warrant action because the harm can be big enough. Like lead, like, okay, we had to lead a national campaign to get that shit out of gas and out of paint and all this stuff. Fine. But you should also be asking what else is going on here. You know, like by your own admission, you're explaining a relatively small amount of the variation here. So like, where's the focus on the other stuff? And I think there are some interesting ones. Like Peter Gray has this whole thing about Common Core, like especially in U.S. schools. And I don't know what it's been like in other places, but he's arguing that school has just become unrelenting for students. Like they have to wake up early. It's fucking with their sleep. They have to do homework all evening. Like they're not seeing their friends enough. And yeah, I'm like, okay, that could definitely be a reason. Like I have seen kids just get busier and busier with schoolwork. You know, that seems like a priori sort of intuitive. Yeah, but it's just odd to me that he like. Interesting. It's like, well, where's the rest of it? You know, like, okay, like even if you're right, where's the rest of it? Like, this is still a big problem to solve here. So like, what's going on?
And the causal thing would be that it's making kids more like cut themselves. Like at some points in the book, he talks about like, it's creating more suicides, more cutting, more depression, more anxiety, more this, more that. Yeah. But that is just cherry picking statistics. Like it could be that it causes a few kids to cut themselves more, while vast numbers of other kids are like becoming more creative and going to more parties and like having like a better life because they're more socially connected. And both of these things can be true, right? Like it can affect the bottom in one way, at the top in a different way, but he doesn't make those fine-grained distinctions. It's just the floor of everything.
Well, it's not the floor of everything. It's the average of everything. So this is what I was getting at with 20, maybe it's beneficial for 20% and bad for 80%, but it just washes out in the averages because it's really good for 20% and bad for 80% and like mildly bad for 80% of people. And you're just not going to discover that. But then there's an interesting social policy question of like, suppose that's true. Suppose it's really excellent for 20% of people who are like these precocious youths who can now read about everything they want to. They can connect with other smart kids. They can start building things early, etc., which is definitely possible. That's some percentage of the population. I don't doubt that there's like at least like 1 to 5% of people who like this is the best time if you're like an information carnivore who's precociously reading everything. Like this is the best time to be a 13-year-old ever, right? And you can connect with other super talented 13-year-olds, start a company by 16. Like this is amazing. And then the question is, how bad do the outcomes have to be for the rest of us so that you actually do something? Like you make it so that these kids now can't talk to anyone on the other side of the world until they're 16. Like that's an interesting question. But yeah, again, if you just study purely at the level of averages, like even cohort averages, you're just not going to discover this. And like, yeah, that's a whole other criticism.
Yeah, very curious to know what people think of this episode.
Yeah.
They'll actually, the people who most need to hear it won't be using the screens in the first place. Hear it on iPad. On iPad anyway. It was fun. So, hell yeah, man.
Nice. Till next time, dude.
To be